Those that know me know that I have a deep love and attachment to the continent. Not least, I was born in the Gambia. My social media handles the Gambian. And I've traveled and I've been blessed and fortunate enough to have traveled extensively around the continent. I'm not someone that calls myself a Pan Africanist, but I appreciate many Pan Africanist philosophies. Not least, I do wholeheartedly believe that a healthy continent makes for a healthy diaspora. So today, joining me, I have someone who is a dear friend of mine who I met in Senegal, and we have mutual friends. Someone who knows all things about the continent as they've traveled around the continent and they cover the continent extensively. Amandla, Wagwan, what are you telling me?
Ah, how you doing, man? It's good to be here.
I'm good, man. Good. Thanks for joining me. I'm so happy to have you on, bro.
My
So tell
pleasure.
me a bit about your work, man. If I go onto your Instagram, sorry, your Twitter, I see Journal of West Africa. What does that entail?
Yeah, so I'm a journalist basically, and I've been a journalist for the last 7 years, and for the last two and a half,
Hmm.
3 years, I've been living in Senegal, and from there I cover West Africa. So I've been working for a few publications, Middle East Eye and Al Jazeera, and even the Telegraph as well,
Yeah.
and just getting around a bit, traveling a bit, yeah, just getting to know the place, man. And yeah,
Senegal,
it's
how's
been
your
an
one off now,
experience.
bro?
My one off, it's basically is where you left it, basically. I'm afraid to say.
Okay, no worries, no worries, no, worries, no, no. What do you mean you cover West Africa? Yeah, what are you covering? What kind of stuff are you covering?
Yeah, exactly. So a few things I've covered, for example, I covered the elections in Mauritania, for example. I started Mauritania 'cause I think that's an interesting country to start with. So I was sent there by a
Okay.
publication to cover the presidential elections there. And I basically
Hmm.
had to try and find out about the different communities that are voting in the election. So on the first day, I went out
Wow,
into the desert, into the Sahara, right? And, it sounds a bit
wow.
cliche, but there was like a kind of meeting, in this tent in the desert. And you had people drawn from what are known as the kind of Bedains, the Arab Berber community of Mauritania. And they were
Yeah.
supporting one of the candidates. I sat down, I spoke to them and everything. And I think that the one thing about Mauritania, right, is that people often have this impression that the Arab Berbers are the dominant, they're kind of like, in terms of the numbers, they're the dominant group. What I sort of found, right, when I was sort of sitting there, I
Hmm.
saw that the people coming to serve the drinks, the people coming to serve the food were black people, right? And that kind of surprised me because it's not something that I
Yeah.
really hear about in Mauritania, right? I understand this is like a learning
Hmm.
curve for me being out there in West Africa. Later on down in the week,
Yeah.
we went to some other communities and we went to see the black communities in Mauritania. And
Yeah.
it was like a world apart basically. Like you saw that the conditions they were living in were completely different. The roads we were driving on became like kind of like potholed,
Wow.
flies. It wasn't the best conditions. And I got to understand
Yeah.
basically a little bit more about the sort of demography of the country basically. And
Okay.
so since then basically I've done a lot of work around black Mauritanians. The country has a
Okay.
legacy of slavery. There's a lot of institutional racism. And so that's something that I've sort of done. And so when I say cover, what I mean is that I report basically. So I basically build up contacts in a country, maybe around certain issues.
Hmm.
And when something happens or when something breaks, I try and cover that using those sources basically. So yeah, that's what I mean by
Okay.
cover.
So what you just told me, you're a part-time journalist, part-time anthropologist, part-time gossip queen. No, I'm just playing. I don't mean the last part. Yeah, you're a
That's
G. You're a
basically
G.
it. That's
You're a G.
basically it, to be
No, but
honest.
honestly. Nah, but what
Basically
I
it.
want to challenge, not challenge you, so I do want to ask you though, because many people don't know what journalists do. So talk me through
Yeah.
like how you get breaking news, or is that something that is that classified, or talk me through your work, for
Yeah.
example.
Yeah. So, like these things work differently. They work in different ways, right? So let me
Okay.
give you an example. So like sometimes you're just like I might be there reading the news or I'm reading Twitter and I see that something happens, it grabs my attention,
Yeah.
right? And so what I might do is just like, drop that
Okay.
person like a DM and say like, slide in and say like I'm a journalist, like, you're interested in talking to me, I'm really interested
Okay.
in this issue. So then I'll talk to that. Maybe I talk to that person, right? So let's take an example now. I did a story about a year ago about Mauritanian refugees in
Hmm.
Senegal, in the north of Senegal, and I literally found someone on Twitter, and we did a few stories together.
Hmm.
And one day he like tweeted something about these refugees in these Mauritanian refugees in Senegal. So I asked him basically. He put me in touch
Hmm.
with someone else, and that person said that I could travel with him to go meet these refugees. It's like a
Yeah.
6 or 7 hour journey. So I had to
Hmm.
basically do some preparation beforehand. I had to try and research the situation, the history of the reason why these refugees are now living in Senegal. I had to like
Yeah.
think about possible angles I could take, And I went up there into this place. I had to also bring a translator with me as well because they speak Fulani, the Fulani language. It's not a language that I speak. So we got up there, and it was interesting because I was met by the village chief, and the entire sort of community sat down basically in a circle around me, right? And I had to pitch to them,
Oh, wow.
convince them that what I wanted to do was something that was worthwhile, and that I wasn't there to waste their time, and that I was trying to basically be of benefit to them. Right, and then I spoke to them, and
Wow.
they kind of conferred among themselves. Like literally, they asked me questions, some challenging questions, and then eventually
Why does it sound
kind
like you're engaging in a scene from Nollywood here?
yeah, it's got it's got that sort of thing. It's literally, I had to go and pitch to the village chief. It's one of them ones. Like honestly,
I love it. I
it
love
was
it.
amazing, yeah. And like while we're talking, like the kids playing football. There's like sheep running around. The place is dusty. It's like, and then afterwards,
Yeah.
I kind of got their trust, and I started interviewing them. And when you sort of interview them, so you basically it's a difficult process because as you're interviewing
Okay.
someone, you're thinking in your head like, what direction? Like they're telling me their story, but how can I put this down on paper, right? And then I'm thinking about
Yes.
how can I basically translate what I'm seeing and what I'm hearing onto paper. So what I mean is that it's not just about the story they're telling. I'm also thinking about the way they're looking, right? The way they're talking to me, the way they're sitting down, what they're wearing, the scars on their faces.
Wow.
Maybe they have like this particular community. They had like the women had like
Damn.
tattoos on their lips, things like that. So I have to try and capture like
Yeah.
all of that, and it's quite a difficult process. And then afterwards, you got to get that all kind of transcribed. You get like a big sort of translate all of that stuff, get it transcribed in a big text, and then you've got to try and go through
Yeah.
it and try and pull out a way to tell their story. Basically, that's something I can't really describe. It's
I
just kind
love
of
that. No,
you
thanks,
spend
thanks for
time with
that
it, and it just
breakdown.
happens.
That's you're like one of those. I just imagine like an old school griot telling the stories of the people. Obviously from West Africa, we have the tradition of the old tradition of the
Of course,
griot,
of
and
course, of
the
course.
griot was
Yeah,
entrusted with keeping the stories alive of the people. And I think that's you're the modern
exactly.
day griot, and I love that. I love that.
Yeah, I mean,
For those who don't know,
I
I'd
think that's
recommend
definitely
people
part of it.
to kind of Google what the griot is.
No, I think that's definitely part of it. Keeping certain stories alive. I think that's a big part of it, actually.
Okay.
Go on, yeah,
Let's unpack that a
sure.
little bit. What did you do? So, how did you get to become a journalist in West Africa? That's a question now, because you're not West African, are you?
Yeah, so I mean, okay, I mean, I have a connection. I have roots in West Africa, right? I'm sure of that.
Okay.
And the story of my family basically that's come down to us is that my great grandmother was basically
Mm-hmm.
forced into a slave ship in the Gambia, right? It wasn't the Gambia
Oh,
then, but at
wow.
the beginning of the 19th century, she was put into a slave ship and taken to the ship that actually was heading to America, but it got shipwrecked in the Caribbean, right? And she had to swim for safety basically to the shore, and she arrived on the island of St. Vincent. And the island of St. Vincent at the time, that there was slavery on the island. So she ran, basically, and she basically settled
Yeah.
under, sort of on the coast, under some hills, in a place called Edinburgh, where my family still reside today. And what's interesting is that on top of those
Wow.
hills, that's where the British have their main fortification on the island. So she literally was kind of shadowed underneath the main British, the cannons and everything else that, they kind of solidified their hold. So yeah, so my family come from the Caribbean, and I guess growing up, my parents I've always had like a strong connection to the continent.
Yeah.
They gave me a name, Amandla, which means freedom, power, which is a name, from South Africa, right? And which was like the
Yeah.
sort of like the slogan of the ANC, of the anti-apartheid movement. So there's always like a kind of African consciousness. So it was never Africa was never something alien to me as such.
Okay.
But what happened is I basically got like a scholarship basically a few years ago, and I decided that actually, I would like to maybe just use that money to travel. And I went to Senegal for a little while, and
Okay.
it just kind of worked out, and I just decided to stay there for longer. Yeah.
And what are some like the biggest like takeaways, like also big stories, or like if what is it about West Africa that made you stay there for so long?
Yeah, it's a good point. I think for me, I found it a very peaceful experience. There are a lot of things I don't need to deal with like when I'm over there, right? So I don't need to deal with racism.
Yeah.
I don't need to deal with Islamophobia, right? And
Let's
and
unpack.
and
Let's
you
unpack.
also
We should unpack that. We should unpack. I think we
yeah
should unpack that a bit
yeah go
further.
on
Why?
yeah
I tell them a lot. If people who are familiar with Akala's book, The Natives, he says
yeah
that he kind of dispels this rumor that Africans sold Africans, and I tell that people have to understand, pre-colonial Africa was not divided into nation states. It
sure
was
sure
purely
sure
on on tribal lines and
Sure.
ethnicity. So, for example,
Sure.
people did not kind of feel affinity to those people. Let's say someone was in modern day Nigeria, a Hausa, did not feel affinity to a Mandinka in Mali, or in what is modern day Mali, and what in modern day Senegal and Gambia. Because again,
Sure.
these were not the demarcating factors were not colors. We're not, only
Sure.
when the emergence of white people come to the continent, we now have something called a black as a race, and that's in
Sure.
contradistinction to white people as a race. So obviously, naturally,
Sure.
again, when I go with Africa now, even though again we are both aware that there's a massive colorism problem, but unpack it further when you
Sure.
say that there's no,
Absolutely.
I don't experience race in West Africa. Unpack it further for me.
Yeah. 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 Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, I'll say two things, right? So one is that the people around me are not judging me based on my race, basically,
Mm-hmm.
right? There isn't like a sort
Yeah.
of, they don't have like a sort of innate suspicion, or it's not, I'm not othered because of the color of my skin, right?
Oh,
And
I lost you
what's quite
there.
interesting in Senegal is that people always think I'm Senegalese. Like I will speak to them in English and they're still convinced I'm Senegalese. So
I
that's another
lost you
layer. They don't
there.
even think I'm foreign in a way, which is quite a weird experience because when I'm in the Caribbean,
Sorry,
for
bro,
example.
you cut out quite for a bit, Sorry, you cut out
Sorry.
quite a bit. Can you go
Yeah, sorry.
from no worries? Can you go from the point of people don't judge you by your race?
Yeah, so when I'm in Senegal, for example,
Yeah.
I'm not being judged by the color of my skin. People are not assigning my value isn't dependent on what my skin color is, right? So people aren't
Yes.
going to look at me and say that he's a bit suspicious because he's black, right? Or
Yes.
and that's really interesting. But I think on top of that as well, Senegalese people always think I'm Senegalese. Like I will speak to them in English because that's the language I speak, and they'll be adamant that I'm Senegalese, right? So that in a way like makes me feel even more kind of accepted in a way, and not kind of othered as someone else. And it's
Yeah.
interesting because in the Caribbean, people are very quick to note that I'm not born in the Caribbean, right? And actually, a lot of people ask me, "Are you African? Are you African? Are you African?" It's a question I get all the time in the Caribbean, which is quite remarkable considering how I'm treated in in
Yeah.
Senegal. And but at the same time, I should say this, right? Is that in Senegal, like at the same time, I haven't been to a country that where the sort of the colonial roots.
Yeah.
The roots of colonialism are so evident in Senegal at the same time, right? You know,
Unpack that further for me. What do you mean by
yeah.
that?
So there are many things I think it being a black country, right, and
Yeah.
with people there not having to face everyday racism that people in the West would face, people in Britain would face, or people in America would face. It means that they haven't really.
Yeah.
It means they haven't been forced to develop a sort of an anti-racist sort of outlook as such in this, in the same way that we might. Yes, you had
Mm,
anti-colonial heroes and stuff like that, but that generation is kind of gone basically, right? So I kind of
of
find that
course.
people are comfortable with things that we, in the West, yeah, would not tolerate, right? So I'll give you a few examples, right? Um,
Oh, okay. What do you
I
mean?
went,
Yeah, give an example. Yes.
yeah. So, like for example, some people would have heard of Gorée Island, basically, which is an island off the coast of Dakar, off the coast of
Yes.
Senegal, where many slaves were
If
brought
those
to before they
if
were
those
shipped
who want
off.
to know about the Gorée Island, here where Akon is saying Gorée Islands where all the slaves were shipped from. That's in his song Senegal. That's an amazing
Right,
song by
right, right.
Akon. But yeah, carry on.
Right, right. Yeah. So I went to there's like a museum, the House of Slaves, been to together, I remember. And the tour guide was literally just
Yeah.
like saying to us that it was Africans' fault for slavery. Like he was just pinning the blame on Africans and reducing the blame
Wow.
on the European powers. And that was like super bizarre. Like, there was no outcry about that, right? On top of that, in Gorée Island,
Yeah.
the symbol of the brutality of slavery, there literally was a square called the place of Europe, the Place de l'Europe, basically, right? This kind of square with the European Union flag and
Yeah.
everything. And it just made me think as well, like how why would you tolerate that? And the reason that I've sort of realized is because there isn't this sort
Mm.
of in your face racism all the time. And so people are maybe a little bit tolerant of things that we wouldn't tolerate, in the West. That for me, it can be a bit troubling at times because, Senegal is a country where the currency is still a colonial currency.
It's still tied to the French. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah.
Exactly, right? There are many things really that you see they haven't really dealt with. So so my point is that on a day-to-day level, in terms of like interpersonal relationships, racism isn't there. But when you look at the bigger picture,
Yes.
right? When you look at Senegal's place in the world, its relationships with other countries, I mean, those relationships are still basically premised on racism and white supremacy and colonialism, right?
Wow, that's a very tough charge. So let's unpack that even further then. So in terms of compare, if we're gonna that's a very tough job. If we're gonna compare it now, so what you're saying essentially, black people in Senegal are less equipped to deal with racism, or the racism is just different.
I'm saying that I mean, I've, a friend of mine, Maram Gay, she's a professor,
Yeah.
Senegalese, she's a professor in America, and she said to me that, like, she became black when she arrived in the US, right? She wasn't exposed.
Mm.
She didn't really understand racism, even race for that matter, until she left Senegal and went to the West, So, I think a lot of these things, our responses, our anti-racism and our campaigning and the work that we do is, really does arise from our experience in relation to a dominant culture, a majority culture, which is not black, which is white, right? That's where it rises from. And because those circumstances don't exist in Senegal, they're not seen as an issue, if that makes sense.
No. Absolutely makes sense.
Yeah, yeah.
Absolutely makes sense. So then, okay, I have two questions then. I've
Sure.
been talking recently about a global diasporic identity, yeah? But
Mm.
what you're saying essentially then, that global diasporic identity, black identity, can only be formed and connected through those in the West or those in the diaspora. And you won't
No,
necessarily have a
no.
connection because again, when people
Yeah.
ask me,
Mm.
what do you mean by global diasporic identity? What do you mean by this? And people say, but we have Somalis who are East African, different culture, different language, they
Sure.
don't whatever, and then we have West Africans, different culture, and it's an
Sure.
amalgamation of different ethnicities.
Mm.
But I often say no. Our global identity in the West is that we come under this term black. When the police stops you or me, he's not thinking to himself, oh, but this person's Gambian, I'm going to let this go. He's from St.
Yeah.
Kitts, I'm going to let him go. It's just black. It's just a
Yeah.
black person, yeah? So I'm
Sure,
saying
sure.
that technically we come under this term black and because we experience the Western world as black people. But you're saying then
Sure.
the race, if we want to do anti-racism work on the continent, then will be much different then.
Sure.
And what would that even look like, for example?
Yeah.
Because again, there is racism on the continent. There's exploitation. There's a legacy of colonialism,
Yeah.
which is very heavy and still continues to
Sure.
exploit and weighs heavy on the continent.
Absolutely.
So I don't know, what would that kind of global anti-race work look like in your eyes?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question, and I think that one of the problems on the continent is to do with education, right? As I've said, the forces of neocolonialism are really very, very, very evident in Senegal. From the money, from the language, from whatever, and it's a matter of if people were alive to that, right? If people were educated and alive to that, and let me just make it clear that some people are very alive to it, right? There are many people in Senegal. There's a strong sort of activists, sort of groupings who are very alive to it. But if people were more alive to it, then they would understand that their current position as Senegalese people is built on a history of racism. It's built on a history of slavery. It's built on a history of colonialism, right? So for me, it's the bigger picture of racism that I'm talking about. People are basically not being educated about it. And I think that if they were, then they would see themselves very differently. Is that sort of making sense?
Yeah, that makes absolute sense. Makes absolute sense. But then the question is, on the continent, do they feel connected to the global black struggle?
Yeah, it's another good question again. So one of the things, so when we had Black Lives Matter, for example, I went down, there was a protest in Senegal, I went down to it. It's maybe about like kind of 50 people. It wasn't like a big crowd and stuff. And they had some speeches, some people were sort of, talking about the violence in America and how they obviously, stand in solidarity with it. But one of the interesting things about Senegal, or living in Senegal, is that because this is a country within the Francophone zone, it's a French-speaking country.
Exactly.
It basically means that it's not open, right? It's not plugged in to the same circuits of activism, the same circuits of culture as we are here in the UK, or people in Gambia might be, or people in Nigeria might be, or people in America. Right? Language, really makes a difference. And, let's not forget, for example, that France, right? So, many Senegalese will go to France and they'll study there and, they'll come back. But France is a country that doesn't actually recognize race. It doesn't recognize blackness, right? It doesn't, it doesn't even have figures for the numbers of black people in France, the number of Arabs in there. It doesn't count these figures. So it has an idea of universalism which doesn't take into account race, right? And so that is also reflected back in Senegal in a way that in the English-speaking world, that is unacceptable.
France sees race, I think France sees race as quite divisive, isn't it? That's the way they use it, isn't it? They see it as quite a divisive tool.
Exactly.
Everyone's just French.
Exactly. And that I think that's definitely reflected in Senegal. That influence is definitely reflected. So being locked into this francophone zone means that, you know,
Mm.
what events taking place in the English speaking world don't penetrate in the same way. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah, 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 that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I mean, but you know, but it's quite fascinating because when you do meet people, what's really interesting, right, is that when you do meet people, and you know, I mean, I should also add that, you know, within the French speaking sphere, there are many, you know, prominent anti-colonialists, anti-imperialists, anti-racists, right? You know, there are people like,
Yeah.
I don't know, like, you know, Sekou Toure, you know, he kind of, you know, had his, you know, he had his critics, but at least, you know, there were
Yes.
people who were standing up to power within that sphere as well. So that's not to
Hmm.
dismiss. There's Frantz Fanon, of
Hmm.
course. There's Aimé Césaire. You know, there's a whole you know, list of people that we can cite when we're talking about this stuff. But I do think that the language divide has an impact on how on kind of like the connections between global Black cultures. And being in Senegal has made me realize actually like that it can be quite presumptuous just to sort of think that there's one kind of global Black culture, because language really does shape how we see the world.
Absolutely. But then, okay, language then. Let's talk about language then. So if they're not, I can totally understand they may not be learning the English speaking revolutionaries, for example. They might know about them, but maybe not have studied them in depth because obviously their main language of transmission and teaching and education was in English. So, for example,
Mm,
it doesn't, not far fetched to say, let's say many people in Senegal might not know in depth the story of Fred Hampton, for example, just for example. But then how
sure.
about the French Revolution, the French writers, for example, would the Senegalese people be well versed with Thomas Sankara, for example?
Yes.
He's made history
Absolutely,
was
absolutely.
French or French Fanon, for example.
Absolutely, yeah. I think you're absolutely right. They are plugged in to those things and those figures, and you know, let's not forget that you know, there's also a history of, you know, Islamic scholars or Islamic figures as well, you know, who were sort
Exactly.
of resisting as well, and we should also recognize that. I guess what I'm saying, however, is that I think that in the English speaking world, and I hope I'm not just sort of I'm overplaying this, but there are university courses, there are professors, there's a whole culture. There, you know, there are think tanks, the institutions,
Yeah.
right, that are devoted towards this, you know, to anti-racism,
Hmm.
and which, you know, there are films, there's media. I think that sort of very sort of fertile culture, it's so kind of overwhelming. In fact, actually, the sort
Hmm.
of the narrative of you know, of civil rights and Black power, you know, and especially because of the fact it comes out of
Yeah.
America, right? America can pump this information around the world, you know, so much. It has, you know, it has that kind of
Exactly.
cultural kind of capital to do that, right? I think that while they can tap into Sankara and these figures, there is so much more that perhaps the average Senegalese person can't always tap into. But I find it interesting that I've come across a few people who've sort of said like they've rejected French. They've said that I don't want to learn French. I want to learn
Okay.
English because English liberates me from, you know, seeing the world, you know, in that way.
I do want to ask you then. This might be a bit of a heavy question, and obviously, I don't
Sure.
want to downplay it. I don't want to get you in trouble either. But are you essentially saying then for Black liberation, in terms of those in the diaspora, it is futile looking towards the continent?
No. So absolutely not. I think the continent is central to liberation, right? I think the continent is central to
Okay,
liberation,
agreed.
right? What I'm basically saying, however, is that because of the interface
Hmm.
of Black people encountering racism, you know, in the West, I think that
Hmm.
there's certain cultures that have developed in response to that. The fact, you know, we can say that the open face of colonialism isn't so evident in places
Yeah.
like Senegal, even though it is there,
Yes.
right? It just means that
Hmm.
people respond very differently, you know. You know, let's not forget
Hmm.
as well that, you know, there's South Africa, you know, there's many places, you know, the colonial experience on the continent of Africa is different throughout as well, and we should also recognize that you know, South Africa
Yeah.
had a very different experience, and South Africa's experience, I guess, is it's completely different from Senegal's. Kenya has its own
Yeah.
experience, you know, with the Mau Mau's and stuff like that. So I mean, I think there's a
Yeah.
wealth that we can learn, no doubt, from Africa. I mean, Africa is, you know, is a center of the kind of liberation struggle for us. So I'm just talking about in terms of the sort of day-to-day struggle and kind of that being in that position of being minorities in the West. I think it does something to the sort of culture, to our culture and what we produce and what we talk about and how we sort of navigate. We're always under the cosh. We're not free actually in the same way that people on the continent are.
Mhm.
You know?
I see. That I like. That I agree with because I feel like I've always said that ultimately, you knowing your time and context the best is going to help you create the most appropriate response to dealing within that context. So I totally understand
Sure.
that. And there's particular nuances and particular idiosyncrasies that those who are living
Sure.
in the West are only
Yeah.
exclusive to those who are in the West. So that's totally understood.
I mean,
So
I would say,
we spoke a lot about.
I would
Carry on.
just add one more point, right? So at the beginning, you spoke about Pan-Africanism. And what's interesting about
Mm-hmm.
Pan-Africanism is that the leading thinkers of Pan-Africanism, which kind of formulated Pan-Africanism, were diaspora people, right? Because they were the ones
Mm-hmm.
who were living in the belly of the beast, so to speak. So they could see it up close,
Exactly.
right? So it was people like,
Exactly.
Marcus Garvey, C.L.R. James. There were people like George Padmore. These were people from the West. And it was really, there were Africans involved as well. But I think that one of the key moments really is when Kwame Nkrumah, Ghana's first president, he studies
Mm-hmm.
in the West and he meets a number of key figures, C.L.R. James and George Padmore, who are both Trinidadians. And he
Mm-hmm.
basically comes back to the continent in 1945 and starts to agitate for independence across the continent. You sort of see this exchange of ideas
Mm-hmm.
taking place in the West because these people
Yes.
have kind of that displacement and alienation had forced them to sort of imagine Africa as a liberated space, if that makes sense. And then from
Exactly.
there, Nkrumah takes that, comes back
Absolutely.
to the continent, and starts to agitate for independence.
Exactly. See, and this is what I'm trying to say. There's an interplay between the diaspora and the continent is something as a link that cannot be underplayed, or it's an inseparable link, really and truly. And this is
It's
why I always say to
inseparable. It's
people,
inseparable.
if you want to understand, if you want to really come to terms with the world we live in, I don't think there's a better tradition in the world of global white supremacy and understanding it and dealing with the hierarchical structures of power. The Black radical tradition, which is born out of the interplay of figures like Garvey, Malcolm X,
Sure.
MLK, and different, and the list goes on. The Black
Yeah.
radical tradition, to me, is the most encompassing because it
Yeah.
has dealt with the master, quote unquote, in quotation marks, at the longest. It has been the
Yeah. Yeah.
subject
Yeah.
of these
Absolutely.
power structures the longest. It
Absolutely.
knows what it's talking about.
Absolutely.
That's why I think I spoke a lot about what we can learn. Also, what the continent can learn from us. Now, what are some takeaways do you think us in the diaspora can learn from those who are living in the continent?
Yeah, it's another good question. If I can just, I think one thing that people in the continent definitely have is one of the things I love about Senegal is that there's like a kind of like innate sense of like brotherhood between people. Like so
Mm-hmm.
basically like if you were to like basically like I don't know like rate a society by how close two random people sitting on a bus, how their level of
Yeah.
interaction in London, it'll kind of be I don't know like a little bit of sort of like suspicion, like who is this person sitting next to me on the bus? That could, maybe sort of like, I don't know, the conversation might get as far as talking about the weather or something like that. And not very far. In Senegal, there's a sort of like an understanding that you're my brother or you're my sister, like kind of straight away. And I've got a few examples of
Mm.
this. It's quite a few kind of like funny examples.
What
Uh,
sticks out to you?
yeah, well, one of them actually was quite weird. I was on a plane actually coming back from Senegal, and the plane was about to take off.
Yeah.
And this really surprised me, given Senegal is quite a conservative country, right? And socially conservative.
Yeah.
And I was sitting on the plane, and this woman thrusts her hand basically, like from behind me through the seat. So like I'm sitting on the plane, and this woman's hand is coming like in front of me through the seat behind me. I'm like, what's going on? I look back, and she's like,
Yeah.
it's really strange. So I look back, and she's like almost crying. So I'm like, what's going on? And she motions to me to hold her hand basically. And the problem she was having was actually like
Oh.
she's basically scared of flying, basically. So when the plane was taking off,
Oh. Oh.
right, she needed someone to like kind of just like hold her to like make sure she was okay, right? And that struck me as quite like she like she felt that she could do that. It wasn't seen as something strange, and it was expected that I would
Yeah.
also respond in kind. I kind of
Yeah.
appreciated that. It was a bit of a weird experience, I have to say, but I kind of appreciated that was fine. I mean, another example, when I was coming to London a few weeks ago, like this old man just comes up to me and he's just like, can you fill out I had to fill out a form for COVID. He's like, can you fill out my form? And the expectation is that I'm going to fill out his form, and the fact that he asked me to do it, right, I think is
Yeah.
testament to the fact that he just sees me as someone, as a brother or someone that can help him. And I really
Mm-hmm.
like that sort of way, of sort of doing things. People don't tend to
I love the hospitality in Senegal, man. Like it's one.
exactly,
I mean, West African hospitality for me is like right up there.
absolutely,
Finally, then on socially conservative, it's very interesting. Then, so then let's say, how
yeah.
about do they talk about the stuff we have in the West? Then let's say right now with the trans movement, for example, is that something that's a topic of discussion? Is that they're aware of those things in Senegal?
Yeah, so I guess I'm laughing because these things do pop up every now and again, and they've popped up in
Yeah.
in Mali and other countries as well. and
Okay.
then they're often basically kind of presented as being Western phenomenons, basically. And the sort of
Okay.
idea that people talk about is that we don't have LGBT people here, they don't exist, and this is a Western phenomenon, and kind of all of that. The other side of it, of that, right, is that
Yeah.
I've kind of gathered this from speaking to people. One thing about Senegalese society, and I see it myself, is that people don't ask too many questions. People kind of live and let live, actually.
Yeah.
And when there are incidents, or when people start to sort of bang the drum about this and that is Western and we don't have these people here, there have been instances actually when there have been attacks or people have been forced to leave the country because this seems to rile people
Wow.
up in some ways. So yeah, this. I mean, basically, the sort of culture war that if you want to put it like that, that
Yeah.
you sort of that you sort of see in the West, between sort of, I guess, socially liberals and social conservatives. I've seen it play out in Senegal, and it hasn't always been pretty.
Wow.
Yeah.
I mean, we could talk forever, man. This has been a truly insightful conversation. I love this conversation. You are a force for good. I think I'm gonna post Amandla's handles before we. I cannot forget one of the most
Thank you.
important things. You have a book coming out, or is already out?
Yeah. I just yeah. Thank you. I just had a book come out. It's a small book. It's a text, and it's about Stokely
Yeah,
Carmichael, Kwame Ture. He was one of the
my
leaders of
guy.
the
That's
Black,
my guy.
Black Power movement. Yeah. He's someone who a lot of people know and have taken inspiration from. What I realized actually was that there's nothing really written about him, about the time he spent in Africa. And he lived in Guinea, in West Africa, for about 29, 30 years. And there was nothing written
Mm-hmm.
about that period of his life. So I basically, I found some of his old comrades. I went to Guinea. I traveled even, to Trinidad and to other places. And
Oh
I've written like a small book
no!
basically
You're gonna
about
make
it.
me. You're gonna
Yeah.
make me talk another hour with you, bro.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, it's really been a journey for me as well, right? Because I think the conversation that we're talking
Yeah.
about, the diaspora and Africa and stuff, that's something that he was born in Trinidad, he went to live in the US, and then he came to
Yeah.
Africa, right? So he kind of had been
Yeah.
on that journey as well between the continent and the diaspora, and it's been, and so kind of researching him has kind of helped me to understand a bit more about the the relationship between the continent and the diaspora. So yeah, it's really a fascinating. He's a fascinating person. I mean, I'll just say one thing about him. Maybe a couple of things if I can. One of them is that
Please, please.
yeah, I find it really interesting the fact that this was someone who was a quintessential Pan African. He goes down as one of the biggest Pan
Mhm.
African figures, but he also was looking at struggles beyond the Pan African sphere, right? So he was very, very vocal on the
Mm.
rights of Palestinians, for example. Very, very, very vocal, actually.
Mm.
And arguably, he might go down actually as the most vocal black supporter of Palestinian rights that there has been, right? And another thing that I found so fascinating was the way that he tried to live by his values in his personal life as well. So I went to the neighborhood that he lived in for the last like 9 years of his life, and this is like what, 20
Wow.
years after he died, and people still remembered him, people still talking about him. The fact that he would open his house, it would be like a community center. All the children would come and play. Every Sunday, without fail, he would take the children down to the beach. They'll go to islands off the coast of Guinea. So they have to take a boat and then go to the beach on these islands. And he'd be teaching them how to swim, as well as sort of giving them lectures about, them needing to sort of stick close together. And I spoke to his eldest son, Boka, and one of the things he said was that Kwame Ture was very adamant that Boka, for example, his son, would have an upbringing that was exactly like any other child in Guinea. So he wanted to send him to
Wow.
the mum's village, like to learn the Quran, and just to be like a village boy. He didn't want him to have like a sort of a privileged education. His mum wanted obviously to have
Wow.
the best for her son, and so there was a kind of clash there. But I just found it so fascinating that for all those years he really tried to stick by his principles. He wasn't perfect, and I talk about some of the mistakes or the contradictions that he makes. He really tried to live the life that he often spoke about in his speeches, and everything else.
It's interesting. His commentary is a towering figure. I mean, J. Edgar Hoover
Yeah,
says about him, he is like the second Malcolm X, literally.
right,
So,
exactly, exactly,
so yeah, okay.
exactly.
Again, I know we can talk forever about him. I think we might have to another time. We might have to. I'm gonna have to
I'll,
do an
I'll,
episode on
I'll,
Kwame Ture and talk
I'll
about
be
your
I'll be
research.
more than happy to.
Yeah, I'm gonna
I'll
keep
be
it.
more than happy to, bro.
So where can we get the book, bro?
So it's available from Chimurenga. So it's published by a magazine called Chimurenga. And I'll just read out
Okay.
the website. So Chimurenga, which is spelled Chimurenga, Chimurenga Chronic,
Mm-hmm.
Chimurenga Chronic, CHRONIC.co.za.
Mm-hmm.
ZA being South Africa, it's based in South Africa. Chimurenga and you can order the book there.
And I will post that in section about the about section of this episode. Please, I'll post Amandla's
Okay, brilliant.
socials, and I'll post the book link there as well. So, guys, you are listening to The Malcolm Effect with your host, Mamadou. This has been a truly insightful conversation. Please like, comment, share, subscribe, wherever you're listening to, whether that's on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, or Spotify. And until next time, take